I found myself standing outside his door, barefoot and uncertain. I wasn't sure why. I wasn't even sure what I was hoping for. Maybe I just needed to feel close to someone who understood the same ache I carried. Before I could knock, the door opened. He stood there, surprised but not startled. Before the story begins, please like the video and subscribe as it helps me a lot. The house felt quieter after Mom passed. Her presence had always been this soft, ever-present hum in the background of our lives. Without it, there was a stillness that settled over everything, especially Dad. He didn't say much in the beginning, just moved through the motions like a man searching for purpose. And I watched him. I watched how his hands trembled slightly when he made coffee, how his eyes lingered on her photograph a moment longer each day, how he'd sit on the edge of the couch and look like he was waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. I stayed with him, of course. It didn't feel right to leave him alone in that big house. We were two shadows under the same roof, tied by grief but unsure of how to comfort each other. I started cooking for him. He started fixing things around the house. Drawers that hadn't worked in years, lights that flickered too often. It was his way of giving back, I suppose. Silent thank you. Quiet companionship. One evening after dinner, I found him sitting in the backyard, staring up at the stars. I brought him a cup of tea, and he looked at me with eyes that held something I couldn't quite name. You always know what I need before I ask, he said softly. I've had a lifetime to learn you, I replied. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You remind me of her. Sometimes too much. The way he said it made my breath catch. I didn't know what to say. There was a weight in his gaze, something warm and aching. It wasn't the first time he'd looked at me that way lately. I'd felt it, even if I couldn't admit it to myself. Nights grew colder, and he started sitting closer to me on the couch. Our conversations became deeper. Memories shared, regrets confessed. There was one night, particularly quiet, when the power had gone out and we sat in the candlelight. I was curled up in a blanket, and he was beside me, his arm resting behind me on the couch. Not touching, just close enough for me to feel his warmth. Do you ever wonder, he began, his voice barely above a whisper, why some people leave too soon and others are left behind to make sense of it all? I turned to him, our faces just inches apart. Maybe it's because the ones left behind still have something to feel, something to learn. He nodded slowly, his eyes searching mine. That moment held its breath between us. I looked away first, afraid of what I might see if I didn't. The lines between comfort and closeness began to blur. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even spoken. But I started noticing the little things. The way he'd brush a strand of hair behind my ear when I was distracted. How his fingers lingered on mine when he handed me a cup. The looks he gave me, soft, full of something I couldn't name but felt down to my bones. One night, after we had cleaned the kitchen together, I felt his hand rest on my lower back as I reached for a towel. Not in a way that startled me. Felt grounding. But I could feel my pulse quicken, feel the warmth rise up my neck. I turned to him, and he was already looking at me. I'm sorry, he said gently, drawing his hand back. I shook my head. You don't have to be. The silence that followed was full of meaning. Neither of us moved. The air between us was thick with the kind of emotion that needs no words. I began to see him differently, not just as my father, but as a man, one who had loved deeply, lost painfully, and was still capable of feeling, of needing, of yearning. And maybe I was beginning to yearn too. Not in any reckless way, but in the quiet, late-night kind of way. The kind that sneaks in when the world is asleep and the heart is wide awake. One Sunday afternoon, we sat together going through old photo albums. His fingers lingered over a picture of me as a child, seated on Mom's lap, both of them smiling at the camera. She loved you so much, he murmured. He nodded. I know. She used to say you were a mirror of my soul. That you understood me even when she couldn't. I looked at him, heart pounding. Do you think she'd be upset with how close we've become? He asked suddenly. The question made my throat tighten. No, I said after a pause. I think she'd be happy that we're not alone." He reached over and brushed his fingers against mine, barely touching. "Sometimes I think I see her in you. But then I realize it's not her. Just you. And I don't know if I've ever really seen you before." Something in me ached. Not with confusion but with recognition. Of being seen. Of being needed in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel until then. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the soft sounds of the house, remembering the way his voice had trembled slightly when he said that. Remembering how it had made something in me stir. I found myself standing outside his door, barefoot and uncertain. I wasn't sure why. I wasn't even sure what I was hoping for. Maybe I just needed to see him to feel that quiet connection again. Before I could knock, the door opened. He stood there, surprised but not startled. As if he'd been waiting. "I couldn't sleep," I said quietly. "Neither could I." There was a long pause between us, and then he stepped aside. "Come in." We sat on the edge of his bed, the room bathed in soft amber from the hallway light. I hugged my knees to my chest, and he sat beside me, hands folded in his lap. "I think we're both a little lost," I said. "I think you're the only thing keeping me found," he replied. My heart tightened. "You don't have to say that." "I'm not saying it because I have to." I turned to him, meeting his gaze. There was something raw there, open, honest. Not a man speaking to his daughter. A man speaking to someone he trusted. Someone who had seen him at his most broken. "I don't know what this is," I whispered. "But it doesn't feel wrong." "It doesn't to me either," he said, equally soft. He reached out, brushing the back of his fingers against my cheek. A gesture so tender it made me close my eyes. Not because I was afraid but because it felt too much and yet not enough. We didn't say anything after that. We didn't have to. Eventually I lay beside him, not touching, just breathing the same air. Feeling the warmth of his presence beside me. And in that silence, I knew something had shifted. The world outside kept spinning, but in that room time stood still. Not for answers, not for labels, but for the quiet truth that two souls, lonely, grieving and human, had found something in each other that felt like home. The morning after that night, I woke up before him. The sun hadn't fully risen, but a soft light filtered through the curtains, casting a golden hue across the room. I lay still, listening to the steady rhythm of his breath beside me. There was a calmness in that moment, an unspoken understanding that neither of us had the words to name, but both of us felt deeply. I rose quietly, not wanting to disturb him. As I stepped into the hallway, a wave of something unfamiliar washed over me. An ache, maybe, or the realization that nothing would ever be the same. And strangely, I didn't feel fear. Felt clarity. There had been no confessions in the night. No actions to regret. Just the quiet comfort of presence, of not being alone in a world that had suddenly felt so empty. But something had changed between us. We both knew it. And I could feel it in the way my heart beat a little faster when he stirred next to me. He opened his eyes and turned his head slightly, meeting my gaze with a quiet smile. "Morning," he said, his voice hoarse with sleep. "Morning." Neither of us moved. Felt delicate that moment, like we might break it if we said the wrong thing. But he reached over, gently brushing a strand of hair from my face, and it steadied something inside me. "I was afraid you might not still be here," he murmured. "I'm here," I whispered. He nodded, his hand resting against my arm. "I don't know what this means, but I know it feels right." Did. And that terrified me. The rest of the day passed in a quiet haze. We didn't talk about what had happened or what hadn't. We just moved through the house like always. Me cooking breakfast, him fixing a loose hinge on the door, but something was undeniably different. There was a new softness between us. A tenderness in the way he looked at me, and a warmth in how I responded. We were careful, respectful. There was still so much unsaid. That evening, I sat at the dining table flipping through the newspaper, but I wasn't reading it. He was across the room, organizing books on the shelf, humming a tune he used to hum when I was a little girl. A strange feeling bloomed in my chest. Comfort mixed with longing. Familiarity tied with something deeper. He turned suddenly, catching me watching him. Our eyes locked, and a quiet knowing passed between us. "I've been thinking about her a lot lately," he said, walking over and sitting beside me. "Your mother." He nodded. "Me too. She was strong," he continued, "but she kept things inside. There were things she never said, things I didn't understand until after she was gone." "Like what?" He hesitated, then looked into my eyes. "Like how hard it was to carry love and loneliness at the same time." His words settled into me slowly, like leaves floating down a stream. I knew what he meant. I'd felt it too. That dual ache, of loving someone, needing someone, and fearing the world would never understand. He reached across the table, took my hand gently in his, and said, "You've become the only thing in this house that still feels alive." My throat tightened. "You're not alone. I'm here." He looked at me then, really looked. As if he'd been waiting a lifetime to find someone who understood. Someone who wouldn't turn away from the depth of his sorrow or the quiet needs he never said out loud. That night, after the dishes were done and the lights were low, I found myself outside his room again. I didn't hesitate this time. I knocked once. He opened the door almost instantly. "I can't keep pretending we're just getting by," I said softly. "This isn't just grief anymore." He stepped aside without a word, letting me in. I stood in the center of the room while he closed the door behind me. We were alone again, wrapped in the silence that had become familiar. But now it felt full, brimming with everything we hadn't dared to admit. "I don't know what this is," I said, my voice trembling. "But I feel something when I'm with you. Something I can't push away." He walked closer, his expression unreadable. "I feel it too. And I've tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just the grief. But it's not. Something else. Something deeper." My eyes stung. "Is it wrong to feel this way?" He reached out, cupping my face with both hands. "How can something feel so wrong and so right at the same time?" I leaned into his touch, letting the warmth of his hands steady me. "I've felt invisible for so long. But with you, I feel seen." "You are seen," he whispered. "You always have been." We stood there for what felt like forever. No promises, no plans. Just two people, hearts open, vulnerable and real. In the days that followed, we fell into a rhythm. We didn't label what we were feeling. There was no need. We just lived in the small moments. The shared coffee in the mornings, the way he'd touch my shoulder when he passed behind me, the soft smiles that lingered just a bit longer than they used to. One evening we went for a walk. The air was crisp, the trees bare, the world quiet in a way that made every breath feel sacred. I reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation. "It feels like the world is starting over," I said. He nodded. "Maybe we are too." Later, as we sat on the back porch watching the sky fade into dusk, he turned to me and said, "Do you think they'd understand? The others?" I knew who he meant. Family, friends, people who lived by simpler expectations. People who would never see beyond titles and traditions. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I'm not living for their understanding." He looked at me, eyes full of emotion. "Neither am I." And in that moment I felt it. The freedom of choosing each other. Not out of rebellion, not out of impulse, but from a place of truth. From years of shared memories, deep-rooted love, and the kind of quiet loyalty that couldn't be faked. We never crossed the lines we both knew existed. Not with words, not with touch, but what we shared, what we allowed ourselves to feel, was more powerful than anything physical. It was emotional, intimate in its own right, sacred. Some nights, he would hold my hand as we sat on the couch in silence. Some mornings he'd pour my coffee before I asked. And every time our eyes met, I knew. We were two people who had lost everything, and yet somehow had found something in each other that felt like salvation. I never tried to explain it to anyone else. I didn't need to. It was enough to know that love, in its purest form, sometimes grows where you least expect it. And sometimes it doesn't need to be loud or conventional to be real. Just needs to be true. And what we had, whatever name the world gave it, was exactly that. True.